Meine Damen und Herren, seien Sie uns herzlich willkommen im Goethe-Institut. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass zu dieser Mittagszeit so viele gekommen sind. A very warm welcome to our theme of today, Rebuilding or Building, a new era of energy efficiency, a transatlantic policy exchange. This event is part of our series around the themes environment and sustainability, which is, as some of you know, a theme which is continuously a main emphasis of our work. We are happy, very happy to organize this event together with our friends from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And as you know, we do a lot of events in cooperation with partners. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation is one of our, let me say, most liked or so. Who are the panelists today? Monika Griefahn, former member of the German Parliament and co-founder of Greenpeace in Germany. Then Brooks Rainwater. He's director of local relations at the American Institute for Architects, the AIA. And Kurt Shickman, director of research at Energy Future Coalition. Today's moderator is Knut Panknin from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And ladies and gentlemen, let us all of them greet with a very warm round of applause. Knut Panknin will introduce our panelists a little bit more in detail afterwards. We are having presentations of 10 minutes, around 10 minutes of every panelist. Afterwards, 30 minutes of a discussion in between the panelists and then with the audience. And now I'm looking forward to an exciting and I think interesting event. Knut, the stage is yours.
I am a program officer with the Washington office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and I also want to extend my thank you to the staff of the Goethe Institute, Norma Broadwater, and also Sylvia Blume for organizing this, and on our side to my colleagues Sebastian Ehreiser and Monika Parson for organizing our discussion today. For the few among you who have not heard about the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, let me say a few words about our organization. We're Germany's oldest and largest nonprofit political foundation, and we're affiliated with Germany's Social Democratic Party and funded by the German Parliament. We are organizationally separate from the Social Democratic Party, but of course we share their core values and ideas and try to promote these with our programs in Washington and in the offices around the world. We have a large network of about 90 offices worldwide, which is an important non-governmental infrastructure for international dialogue. The Washington office, of course, is responsible for our transatlantic dialogue, where we link up German and European discourses with debates in the US and in Canada, actually. Let me say a few words to frame the discussion before getting our panelists to work. When I moved to Washington, D.C. into my apartment, I was a little bit shocked. I was shocked that the insulation of my window was terrible, that I had a single AC unit built into the wall, which was not really insulated either. And when the first winter came around, I noticed that I couldn't regulate my heat. So I went to management and asked, so how can I regulate my heat, or can I turn it off and on again? And they said, well, you can turn it off for the whole winter if you want to. But that, of course, was not my intention. So what that means is whenever I want to cool down my apartment in the winter because it's terribly overheated, I either have to open a window or I have to let my AC run, which is kind of ridiculous. And it also reminds me of my time in East Germany, where I grew up in a high-rise building, and that's exactly the way we regulated our heat in the winter. We would open a window to let the hot air out. And in that sense, the U.S. resembles a socialist country, because you've heard, these comments being made, but actually there's obviously some truth to it. My apartment, of course, is only like anecdotal evidence, but it explains why buildings account for about 70% of electricity consumption in the United States. And even in Germany, where we have some higher standards, the buildings account for about 40% of energy consumption. And when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, we also see some similarities. In the US, buildings contribute about 40% to CO2 emissions, and in Germany about a third. So the US and Germany face similar challenges also when it comes to the existing building stock, because a lot of the buildings that exist have been built at a time when there were no regulations in place. In Germany, about 3/4 of the buildings we have were built before 1979. And in the US, we have buildings here that are standing, and half of the ones that we have already will still be here 30 years down the road. So you see that with new buildings, of course, you can enforce new regulations, you can make them more energy efficient. But one of the big challenges is, what do you do about the existing building stock? So you see that energy upgrades for buildings are a central key to saving energy and also achieving our climate protection targets. And the good thing is the technology exists and can be applied easily. The question is how to do that. So that is why we want to talk about retrofitting today, about residential buildings, commercial buildings, about the potentials that those have, about the policies that are in place, and also the difficult issues and challenges that we face. So now let me hand over to our speakers. Our first speaker will be Monika Griefahn, and as Mr. Brees already mentioned, she's a former member of the German Parliament. She was also a minister on the state level in Germany in Lower Saxony. In 1980, she co-founded Greenpeace Germany, where she also served as director until 1983. Let me also mention that Monika Griefahn just came back from Canada, where the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, together with the German Embassy in Ottawa and some other organizations, hosted a workshop and an idea contest that was called Young Leaders for Future Cities, where we were looking at alternatives to construction in cities, green buildings, and how to make it a livable environment. So Monika will start us off with her presentation and talk about where we are in Germany in terms of energy legislation, what are the policies in place, the incentives that we have for green buildings, and then we can start off with the discussion. So let me hand over to Monika Griefahn.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and the warm welcome. And I think to start with, it's not only 40% but 45% what buildings in Germany take of the energy. It's not only electric energy, but especially heating, which is a big issue in Germany. But we don't do it with electricity. That's why it is calculated differently. So you see that existing buildings is a very important point for the future, because when we look at our country, the demographic change will have the situation that probably 90% of all buildings have already been built. So what we have to do is to do with the existing buildings and not only with new buildings. What I feel is that the pressure has come from the NGOs and from lower levels, means communal levels and land levels, because when I was a Minister for Environment from 1990 to 1998, together with Gerhard Schröder, which you probably know as the Chancellor of Germany, but he was a Prime Minister of Lower Saxony when I was his minister, we did a lot of these things which are now normal on federal level in the land of Lower Saxony, and we made the pressure so that we have a federal government in 1998 who then started a lot of things. To show you what an existing building really can achieve is our Bundestag. Bundestag is a very good example of a really good upgrade of a building. It was a horrible building inside after a lot of renovations after World War II, where it was completely bombed out. And this building now is a very acceptable and agreeable building. And you see on the left side the mirrors there bringing light into the inside of the Bundestag so that the plenary really has daylight. And that's a very good thing. The whole building has no climatization but only ventilation. This is coming through the chimney in this mirrors. And through that ventilation you always have fresh normal air in the rooms in the whole building. And at the same time, you have a cogeneration plant which has energy production and heat production, so that you have 90% efficiency of the production of what you need. And so that's a very good building, and it's visited by a lot of people. It's one of the most visited buildings in Germany. And from all things, it is quite an interesting thing. What we have in the last 20 years is programs to upgrade buildings, and especially the public buildings have been neglected for a long time. This is, for instance, a town hall which has been upgraded through the Konjunkturprogramm, which was a program which is, thanks to the financial crisis made up by the German government in 2008 for the years 2008 to 2010, where a lot of public buildings have been renovated, which couldn't be renovated before, because in Germany, other than in the United States, the public households are so tight that they cannot take loans. So they couldn't upgrade their buildings. They were all in a very, very bad status, and they had bad heating systems, bad insulation status, and so on. So we have, with this program, really made it possible, on one hand, to upgrade these buildings, on the second hand, to keep a lot of people in work, especially on the local level, because craftsmen had to work on place. That are not working places which can be exported easily like industrial places, working places, but they are at the place. So there are people who plumb, who make new walls, who make new windows, who make new heating systems, and that's very good. That's why in Germany we have a relatively, compared to other countries, low unemployment rate through these programs which have been done in the past 2 years through the financial crisis. And finally, we got also the public houses into this upgrading program. But of course, we have also new public houses. This is a wooden house which is created in Freiburg. This is only a model by an American architect, actually, which is Bill McDonough, is just down here in Charlottesville. But I want to show you that upgrading means sometimes you also have to tear down something and to build it new because it's so completely bad. This is, I think, a library in Freiburg. What I think is very important to think about upgrading buildings is that you plan your city properly. We have the tendency to clean out the cities of green. And the green is very important for a lot of things. We need the green in the city, and in the whole planning process, we need to think about it and plan it as well. Especially if we insulate buildings, we have also to think about making the walls green or the roofs green, because then you have at the same time a lot of these arguments I have put down here, because insulation sometimes can make it very sticky inside, and we have also other problems like this is an example how the Ford Center is doing it. This is another one which is in China, where they put even gardens on the roofs so that you can really have some farming on that. Probably you can rethink that as well. But we have the problem, if you insulate your houses better, you have also a poor indoor air quality. And that is one of the biggest problems. In the moment, in Germany, 40% of the children have allergies. And we have no allergy problems in countries where they have not this point of insulation houses and so on. So this is really a problem. And what I want to say is that when we do this upgrading program of insulation, of having new windows, having new energy systems inside, we have also to think about the materials you use. It doesn't make sense only to use PVC to put a new front in front of your house with wood, or to have then other systems with other window systems. You have also to think what kind of carpet you use or what kind of wallpaper you use, because then you have the outgassing of these materials much more easily if you have insulated houses. Like here, I have put on you some wallpaper emissions, some carpet emissions, and even from natural fibers, you have carpet emissions because they are treated by chemicals which are not good for the use of human beings. So I think that is something which in the planning phase has to be done as well. You see, you can have a lot of green even in industrial areas. This is from Ford, which has done a lot of greening on the roofs as well. And you have to plan it in your town also that you live with people. I have sometimes the feeling people think nowadays to reduce CO2, you better don't have any people with it. And I think what we want is we want to have an environment where people feel well, where people can live together, where people can have neighborhood together, and where people really enjoy to be. And that's why also the plan has to be that it makes fun and that you have also public places with it, or even places where people can meet. So what I think you have to think in whole terms, in holistic terms, not only in insulating your house, that you have all aspects like water, like air, like pleasure and beauty. That means that you really like it. That's a nice design and not simply put together to be efficient, but that it is nice. And then you will really get people to do it and to make it. So what kind of things we have done in Germany for that? We have one thing which some people think doesn't have to do something to do with retrofitting houses. It's a Renewable Energy Sources Act. It's very famous, the EEG, because it has been transported in or exported in 45 other countries. And it is a guaranteed fee for solar, wind and other sources for 20 years for a feed-in tariff. And the good thing about it is if you retrofit your house, or the public or the industry is retrofitting their houses, they can plan this energy systems in it at the same time, and through that really gain money. We have, for instance, now farmers who say it's a third harvest because they have put solar roofs on their stables or windmills on their fields. And because there is so much solar and wind and geothermal, for instance, or wood pellets now installed, there are 340,000 new working places in industry and in craftsmen's workshops, which is very important for the unemployment for Germany. And I think that is everywhere the case because it is also a very good export factor. At the moment, renewable energy technique is still exported from Germany. I have the bad fear that with the new government's decision to reduce this guaranteed fee much quicker than it was thought to be reduced, it will hinder and prevent a lot of new investments because banks don't see the security any longer that the fee will be given, and the people will not invest because they are not sure what happens, and they will not be able to pay for that because they don't get the guarantee fee. So I think it's counterproductive that the new government has changed this fee quite drastically just this summer. We have also a Renewable Energy Heats Act, which means that newly erected buildings have to have a certain amount of new energy systems. You can choose whatever you want, solar, wood pellets, biomass, geothermal, even waste heat is possible. And this is also introduced in this old building program, this carbon dioxide refurbishment program. Refurbishment program is probably not a good thing because I personally believe it's really an upgrade for a building. A building will be much cheaper to manage over the years afterwards if you will have done it, so it's really good. And the good thing about this program was that we had loans up to 50,000 euros for residential units, which were very cheap or even as a subsidy sometimes. And it was in 2008 that the 15.8 billion euros we have given from 2005 onwards had triggered 29 billion euros of investments, and 450,000 units could be refurbished. And I think that's a very good result because it really saves money for the people in the long run because you have much less energy to pay for. And at the same time, people had work to install that all. And with these public buildings, I told you before, which only started in 2008, town hall schools, kindergartens, theaters were renovated. We had 3.75 billion in this 2 years, and they have triggered quite a lot as well. We have not the final figures because it is not finished. All this money will be spent in the end of 2010. What I say is, before I talk to you about the allergy problem, you really have to think in your planning, what do you do? So for instance, for the insulation materials, take flax or loam or cellulose instead of glass wool, which is very dangerous. Also think about the rainwater and water recycling, and think about the glue, the carpet and the wallpaper which you use, that you don't have materials which are, have emissions, especially from chlorines, which are very bad for the health. So what I think we have for the future, this is Bill McDonough who has made this this university here, green, which I think we really should aim to is houses like forests or cities like forests and houses like trees, and that's, I think, a very good goal, because then also the climate will be better and we will have even natural diversity with birds, with insects and so on, which is very good for us. And that's why I think all the people who now are going to plan have to think about architecture and sustainability, but have to think at the same time about the humans, and that it's for the humans and not for something who is not there. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Kurt Shickman, and Kurt is the Director of Research for the Energy Future Coalition. The Energy Future Coalition is an interesting organization. It is a joint effort between business, labor, and environmental groups, something I think that was not to be perceived possible a couple of years ago. And his organization advocates energy policies in order to address challenges to the production and use of energy. He also has a master's degree from SAIS, and before achieving that, he was in the consulting business, and he worked for consulting corporate finance for several international firms. So we've heard from Monika about the German policies and what has been achieved, and I'm sure Kurt can address the US perspectives. What's the potential for retrofitting of residential commercial buildings? Where are we in terms of federal legislation such as HomeStar or Building Star programs? And where do you see the US economically and politically on a path to green buildings?
In 2009, we started a group called Rebuilding America, which is really our energy efficiency work. And this brought together builders, other businesses, manufacturers, labor unions, traditional energy efficiency advocates, consumer groups, and others to really work together to develop a policy framework both at the national level and at the state level to drive energy efficiency retrofits in our homes and our businesses, 50 million by 2020. So the idea there was it won't just be federal policy, it will have to be a private sector upswelling that gets this done. So again, why buildings? As you've heard, here in the United States, about 50% of our energy use, that's electricity and natural gas, comes from buildings, and it's roughly a 50-50 split between residential and commercial buildings. In terms of the opportunity of retrofitting buildings, I think it's a massive opportunity. Some of our numbers indicate somewhere in the order of $32 to $64 billion per year in energy savings. That billions of dollars can be going into more productive uses within the economy. If you believe the McKinsey Global Institute, the international consulting firm, they put the total efficiency opportunity for the United States at something in the order of $1.2 trillion by 2020. So it's a massive opportunity. And I think politically important, here's the third point, which is in the United States today, I think there's one of the underlying political themes we're hearing is the emphasis on creating jobs and supporting our small businesses. And if you look at the types of businesses that are doing this work, the construction firms and the manufacturing firms that build the equipment for this, that install it, and that monitor and maintain that equipment, that's an area where the total country has unemployment of 9.6%. These firms are at about 25% unemployment, and in some markets, upwards of 50%. Also interesting here is even on the commercial side, this is an overwhelmingly small business-dominated group of people. So the construction, for example, is 91% of those firms that do that work are firms 20 and less. So when you're hearing discussions about unemployment in the United States and supporting small businesses, this is really a natural place to go to for policy that would support both. This is sort of the bad news part of the conversation, semi-bad news. Next week we're going to have a pretty large midterm election, which will determine a lot of what we're going to see in the lame duck session in November on the Hill and the makeup of the Congress for next year. Regardless of how that comes out, though, I think it's extremely uncertain prospects, and that's probably a nice way of putting it, for most of the energy agenda going forward. There are a couple bright spots there that we may see some movement, particularly on there's a package of tax incentives that would primarily support larger equipment in commercial buildings that are more energy efficient. That's bipartisan in the Senate. And there's also a bill called the HomeStar bill, which is a residentially focused rebate program that allows homeowners to go out and buy energy efficient equipment and services and they earn a rebate either based on the package of equipment that they buy or on the overall performance of the house after the fact. Beyond that, and unfortunately some of the issues that I work on most closely on the commercial side, I don't see much that is going to be moving in this Congress or the next one. That said, that's moved the sort of policy community towards looking at what's available now without, that we can do without additional legislative work. So we're looking at existing executive authorities that are, so existing programs in the agencies that are out there now that are either underfunded but that have money that can be put towards them without additional appropriations from Congress, or that can be tweaked slightly to be more amenable to a building type program. And when you look at what those are out there, it's a pretty significant opportunity. We looked at, with USGBC, U.S. Green Building Council and Natural Resources Defense Council and a few other groups, we looked into federal policy in pretty good detail to determine what was out there on the commercial and multifamily building side. And as it happens across the government, there's about 35 different programs that would directly benefit energy efficiency in large buildings, and that those are already funded or could be funded up to $72 billion without going back to Congress. So that's a significant amount, a pool of money that if it's deployed correctly and deployed intelligently, can really drive the ball forward, even though we're seeing some stagnation on the Hill. And so maybe just to give you a little bit of background on what those things might be, I thought I'd just pull together a few of the ideas on one of the most intractable issues related to freeing up energy efficiency in this country, and that's the financing issue. And I won't go into a lot of detail on these for obvious reasons, but so for example, there's a commercial building tax deduction that exists today that came into being in 2005 that has never had any no tax forms created for it, no regulations written around it. So it's simply a tax deduction that's available to commercial buildings that's actually could be transformative, but it's extremely difficult for buildings to take advantage of. So simply writing the rules on how to take advantage of that could really drive some commercial buildings, especially the more healthy ones, into making the retrofit decision. Number two, I think, is probably the most important on both the residential and the commercial side, and that's really trying to find, creating the guidance for Fannie and Freddie, which holds residential mortgages, and on the commercial side, some of the other bank regulators, to really value energy efficiency appropriately when they're appraising buildings and when they're underwriting buildings. If this is done, this will create an example for the private sector that I think will really free up a lot of private sector financing and really help get this market flowing again. I think coupling with number two is also, and it's not on the slide, but is improving the way energy information is shared with building owners. Especially on the commercial side, the building owner isn't the person that gets the energy bill. So finding a way to bridge that gap between the person making the investment and getting that information so that they can make a good choice and to see whether or not they've made a good choice on the back end is very important. And I think also as we will start to see more and more buildings with the LEED certification, well, there's also opportunities to do an energy use certification that can be placed on the outside of a building, which will then also drive, I think, some changes in the way buildings are valued. The third here is, again, DOE already has the Department of Energy already has a loan guarantee program that can be very easily tweaked to really focus in on buildings and improving the energy efficiency of buildings. I think this is particularly important because over the next 4 years, there's about $1.4 trillion in commercial loans that will be refinanced. And that's really an opportunity for the private sector and the public sector to loan the money that needs to be loaned to get some of these energy efficiency retrofits done. And finally, number four, I think is a little bit more pie in the sky, but I think it could potentially be a game changer. And that's really using the Federal Reserve and some of the activities that they're taking now. And instead of buying, so quantitative easing, let me back up, is when the Fed prints money and then buys bonds. Now, they don't have any restriction on what type of bonds they can buy. So you could see them buying municipal bonds, revenue bonds, or special purpose bonds that are specifically created to fund energy efficiency at the state and local level. This, I think, is a little bit down the road, but I think this could be a real game changer in terms of how energy efficiency is financed from the public sector. So thank you very much for your time, and I can take questions afterwards, or if you have any, you can certainly reach me.
Thank you very much, Kurt, for this picture on the federal level in the United States and the challenges that exist, but also the opportunities that are already there that are not really being taken advantage of. And we can discuss later on why that is the case, and why are there already mechanisms and incentives in place that have not been used so far. Our third speaker is Mr. Brooks Rainwater. He currently serves as the Director of Local Relations at the American Institute of Architects. That is a professional membership association for licensed architects in the United States. And Brooks is responsible for advancing the Institute's goals at the local level. He manages not only legislative but also legal and regulatory efforts. And he is one of the lead authors of a report that AIA has published, which is called Local Leaders in Sustainability, a study of green building programs in our nation's communities. After this kind of semi-gloomy picture that Kurt has painted on the federal level, I think we have a few more brighter spots on the local level where this agenda is being moving forward at a much faster pace. And I'm sure that, that Brooks will touch on some of the findings of the study to see where local initiatives have worked much better than they are actually working right now on the federal level.
So I like to start with this definition. Sustainability means making decisions based on how they will affect not only our generation, but also 7 generations from now. And this is especially poignant for me because I have a child that's going to be born in December. And I really think that I want to be able to look my child in the eye 20 years from now and say that I was able to make a difference, that our generation was finally able to make our environment cleaner and more environmentally friendly. In order to do this, we need to change the building sector, because currently in America, the building sector contributes 40% of all carbon emissions. Oftentimes people think that it's transportation and industry that needs to be fixed, and by far these certainly do need to be fixed. But if we don't approach buildings first, we really can't make the changes that need to be made. And at the AIA, we approach sustainability with a solutions-based approach. And over the last 3 years, we've been working on a research project called Local Leaders in Sustainability that analyzed green building policy at the local level. So starting back in 2007, we reached out to cities across the country. We actually had an intern come in and contact 661 cities, which were all cities larger than 50,000, to find out what kind of green building policies were in place. At the time, this hadn't been done yet. And so we really wanted to get a nationwide survey to find out how communities were incentivizing green building, both at the public level as well as the residential and commercial. And what we found was actually very exciting. Back in 2007, there were 14% of all cities that had programs in place. And fundamentally, most of them mandated that public buildings meet green building standards. And what they did with single-family homes, multifamily homes, and commercial buildings is they incentivized the process. They said that we'll give you a $5,000 credit or other such incentive in order to retrofit your home. And then in 2008, we followed up this original research with a forum that we held here in DC focused specifically on green incentives. We brought together people from the development and design industry as well as the finance and insurance industry to find out what were the best green incentives, what could really be a game changer and make the situation work better for both the retrofit and new construction side. And we found that by and large, tax incentives were the #1 thing. Basically, money really can make things change. The market does work. And so we followed this report up with our Green Counties report, where we worked together with the National Association of Counties, because we wanted to find out, we had looked at cities, but in America, the county structure of government is also strong in some parts of the country. And so we looked at the top 200 counties by population to find out what had been happening there with green building policy as well. And we found that 20% of those counties had green building policies in place. So kind of putting this together, we were able to figure out that about 65 million Americans lived in communities with green building policies that were kind of changing fundamentally their life. As you kind of go into many of these cities, you see the green buildings, you see the green roofs, and it's really making a big difference. Finally, in 2009, we wanted to see what had happened with green building during the economic downturn. So we did the report, Green Building Policy in a Changing Economic Environment, where we followed up with those original cities. We wanted to see what had happened. Had they decreased the number of green building policies? Had they pulled back on incentives? And in fact, we found just the opposite. Green building programs had increased by 50% from 2007 to 2009. We now have 138 cities that have these policies in place. And because of the economic downturn, many of these communities have changed their prime focus. They've moved from just the building to larger neighborhood development projects, certainly moving further and further into the retrofit side. And one of the things they're really focused on is green jobs and green economic development. So here's the chart that kind of really shows you the picture of what's been happening in America with green building policy over the last decade. 2003 really was the cutoff point. You had about 17 cities before then that had policies in place. But from 2003 to 2009, you've gone from 17 to 138. That what happened is green building costs have really come down. You're able to retrofit buildings for much lower cost than you once were. You're able to do new construction for much lower costs. You used to have maybe a 10% premium for a green building. That's come down to between 0 and 2%. So this has made a giant difference. One of the things when you look at the map, though, here, is it's still primarily focused on the east and west coast of America. The west coast was really the leader on all things environmental, and it has been for decades. The east coast is catching up greatly over the last few years, and you're starting to see more activity happening in the middle of the country, too. So what we found with these policies are that the vast majority mandated green building for public buildings, whether that's major renovation, 50% or larger, or whether that's new construction. We found that many of them incentivize sustainable building practices for the private sector, both on the commercial and residential side. I'll get a little bit more into examples in a moment, but what they really did was created tax incentives, rebates, other things that were able to incentivize people to go out and do the retrofits. A growing number of cities are now mandating green building on the private sector. So because when you look back at those cities, the 17 that kind of started and were on the leading edge, many of them are now moving to a mandatory policy environment where it's not just public buildings that are mandatory, but also the private single family and multifamily as well. And as I mentioned, cities are focused on green jobs and green economic development. When we reached out to cities in this latest report, that was the number one thing that they all said. They all had plans on how they were going to bring green jobs into their communities. And one of the ways that they can do this is by incentivizing and increasing the number of green buildings and green retrofits, because it brings the companies that build those products into those communities to be near the development community that needs to use them. So looking at retrofit opportunities and challenges, some of the opportunities that we clearly see are state and local tax incentives for retrofits throughout the country. We identified 41 tax-related incentives at the state and local level. And these primarily focus on new insulation, windows, Energy Star appliances, high-efficiency furnaces, water heaters, and then incentivizing with tax credits solar, wind, and geothermal. And then beyond that, there's over 1,200 additional rebates, grants, loans, and bonds nationwide. As was mentioned, the federal government has kind of been hit or miss, but one of the things that they've done particularly well is in the Recovery Act, they put a large amount of money into retrofits. That just recently, there was the Department of Energy Retrofit Ramp-Up Initiative, which awarded $452 million to 25 communities. And this money is really being used to be a game changer in these communities and work together with the programs that are already in place to really create the environment that we all need. Some of the challenges that we've seen, however, are education. Number one, we need to educate the public on the benefits of retrofits. We need to make them aware of the cost and the benefits, because oftentimes people just look at the cost side without realizing that the payback is incredibly short compared to what it used to be, and that if you put this money out there, within 3 to 5 years, generally, you're able to get the money back, and it's all efficiency gains from there on out. Private sector financing, as was mentioned, is a big problem, both on the individual homeowner side as well as the commercial side. Within the next few years, hopefully this will start to fix itself a little bit. We're starting to see some movement on the commercial side in our latest surveys, but it's just a difficult environment. Local government budget structures and split incentives between multifamily building tenants and landlords are two other things that we really see as challenges. You need to make sure the incentives are in place for the multifamily building owner, because they don't want to go and do the retrofits if they're not kind of seeing the front end of the money when all of the benefits would then be given to the people that live in the building. So we need to make sure and kind of join those together. Some good examples that we've seen are in Portland, Oregon, where federal, state, and local policy can work in a complementary manner. Talking about that retrofit ramp-up program, they just recently received $20 million from Recovery Act funds to work with their program called Clean Energy Works Portland. And so this pilot program is helping 500 homeowners in the community retrofit their homes. And so this is really a great example of where the city came up with the policy, the state had supported it, and the federal government was able to come in with additional money to really ramp up the program. Another great example that we saw is in Cincinnati, where green building has actually been a game changer for the community. That they incentivize up to 75% of green retrofits or new construction. And that's a big number. I mean, that's a big amount of the cost. And so by September 2010, the abatement program had leveraged over $60 million in private investment. And what's been interesting in the economic downturn is that Cincinnati has done much better than other cities in the region and throughout the wider Midwest. And they think that this program has been one of the prime drivers of that situation. So to close, more than half of the buildings that will exist in 2030 are already built. We all need to work to redesign the past so that we can design a sustainable future. Thank you.
After the presentations, I would like to focus maybe on 2 points first and ask the panelists to kind of follow up on things, and something that I found interesting, but also where the question is, Monika, you talked about that, and Brooks and Kurt also talked about the mix between mandatory things that you do through legislation, where you require homeowners to do certain things to their houses, and incentives that you give. So I know Germans are usually stronger on the mandatory side. We like to make laws and then tell people what they have to do with their houses, and the Americans are usually stronger on the incentive side, especially if it's a financial incentive. But maybe you could follow up a little bit. Where do you see the balance? And it's obviously not an either or. How do you kind of move forward? Is it something that you do like a dual track thing? You do incentives and mandatory things, or do you start with incentives and later on, if you see that it works, you make it mandatory? How's the relationship between kind of these two different approaches? And maybe Monika, you start from where you see from the German perspective, if it's more mandatory or more incentive approach, and then I ask Kurt and Brooke to follow up.
I think in the past few years we have shown that the incentive, financial incentive was very important, but it was always combined with a mandatory act. For instance, if I see that now every house which is being sold in the future must have a heat pass, so people know when they buy a house how much energy you use in your house, will automatically bring people to use the possibilities they have to get retrofit. And on top of that, you get an incentive by getting this pass, because you will be paid a certain sum, like 300 euros or so, to get this house analyzed. What could you do? What could you improve? How much will it cost? And what is for you cost effective? So sometimes it is only necessary to do some insulation of the windows, or to do the insulation of the roof, or to have a new power plant, not power plant, but heating system in your cellar, and then you will have already can fulfill a lot of these obligations, and you can even get money for getting this. So I think that has brought a lot of, what do you say, drive into that, because people have done it and they love it. And the EEG, which I told you in the beginning, has added to that, because people, when they change their heating system, at the same time think about whether they do either solar thermal on their roofs, so that they have hot water and don't need any heating in the winter, in the summer, for instance, because the hot water is coming by the sun, or if they put on a solar panel so that they can produce energy and feed it into the electricity grid. This is a little bit a problem, because with the new energy concept of the new government, they have downgraded the feed-in tariff quite a bit, and on top of that they have prolonged the nuclear energy running time. And for that, all the people who want to invest in renewable energies are a little bit on the hold, because they say, oh, we don't know whether the feed-in tariff will be any longer, and we don't know whether we will get the investment back, or we get the money from the bank for doing the investment. So this is really a problem at the moment. We don't know how that will end, because it is still in the process of parliamentary discussion, and also the lands will oppose it, because they think they are part of it, as the second chamber in Germany, the Bundesrat, should approve that, and the federal government says no, they don't have to approve it. There will be probably a thing at the constitutional law court. Sorry, and so I think that is a little bit in the move at the moment. But up till now, it showed really that it can work, and it get people proud to have a roof and to do something with it. It's not any longer like a burden. It's basically like, we're nice. We have a roof and we have no solar. Even in northern Germany, where there's not much sun, we have a lot of people have now roofs. And even if it's shady, you can get energy out of it. And that's a good sign about it, because you really prove that it works, you know, because if you get the money out of it.
Well, I think in terms of where mandatory ends and where voluntary and, say, private sector begins, I think the government has already shown that there's a role for a mandatory target, let's say, for energy efficiency. We've seen this in about 24 to 25 states already, where they've set a target, and the targets are set a little differently in each state, but essentially saying, here's our goal for energy efficiency, and here the requirement is on the utility to go out and make that happen. There's also, as part of the House-passed climate and energy bill, a national target for that. So there's actually an energy efficiency, they're called energy efficiency resource standards. There's one that's in the legislation that's currently, well, it's currently not going anywhere, but that is currently written and passed the House. So that, I think, is an opportunity to help drive the private sector, because the utility is an interesting player in all this, because they hold the relationship with the customer. They have the information. They send bills every month, so they're in constant communication there. They have an opportunity to, in many cases, be the liaison for the customer with the contractor, particularly on the residential side, where that's not exactly a relationship that most homeowners want to be in. I mean, renovating your home is not exactly a convenient thing to do. So to the extent that utilities can take that on as part of their requirements to meet energy efficiency standards, that I think could help the market to some extent. I think it gets much more difficult to mandate individual homeowners to do things, and I think that really on the residential side, that's really where you want to aim it, is at the targets on utilities. I think you can be a little bit more. I think you have a little bit more leeway on the commercial side, but not much more. And by that, I think there's, especially here in D.C., for example, there's requirements on certain types of real estate and certain sizes of real estate that they have to post their energy use information in a public place. That passed 2 years ago through the D.C. City Council. And I think that those types of things could be interesting and will help really bring to light the sustainability or non-sustainability of buildings. We're seeing that also with LEED certifications. It's a very similar type of thing, but this is obviously more focused on the energy piece of it. And I think that as those types of requirements are put in place, then the private sector kicks in, because they see people want to be in a greener building. Tenants want to pay less for energy efficiency, or excuse me, for their energy use. So I think that's how you sort of marry the mandate versus private sector divide there.
It's interesting that you also touched on the transparency issue that Monika made in Germany. If you make the energy use transparent for people, that gives an additional incentives as for residential and owners, as well as for commercial buildings. Do you want to add something to that from the local perspective in terms of the mix between incentives and mandatory requirements?
Sure. I think what we've really seen from the local perspective is incentives are great to get the ball moving. That many of the policies that have been put in place have started out with mandates only on the public sector, because the public sector building has really been kind of the example of best practices. So government in America, in American cities, has really focused on how we can show you how green buildings should be done, how we should renovate buildings to make them more energy efficient. And then once they've kind of used that as the example, they've incentivized the private sector to do the same. But what we actually see is, over time, the incentives have to be ramped up, or actually ramped down, to the point where you get towards a mandatory situation on the private sector as well. I mean, a perfect example of this has happened in San Francisco. Their green building policy was put in place in 1999. The mandates were kind of ramped up over time, that you had a policy that was then, it was updated in 2004, and then in 2008 again. Finally, by 2011, all buildings are going to have to meet a green standard. So it's really the time. You need to make sure that you're bringing the people from the design and development industry into the conversation, and making sure that everyone realizes that this is the way all buildings will be designed. And I think that point is really important, that at some point here, all buildings will be green. We're currently working on something called the International Green Construction Code, which is code language. So you're moving away from just rating systems and other things, and actually saying this is how buildings will be designed. And I think that's the point that we're all moving towards.
Thank you very much. Before opening the floor up to question and answers, I would also like to touch on another challenge that we face, and it's not a secret that the housing market went through a deep crisis here in the United States, and even in Germany it was felt, even if it was less pronounced, because the ownership rate of buildings is lower, I think about half of what it is in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you get residents who have already faced foreclosures or who are at the brink of foreclosure to invest money into their homes at a point where there's no extra cash available, even if 3 or 5 years down the road they would already start seeing the savings on their energy bills? So I think it's a very hard argument to make, and I'm not even sure if the return rate or the return time is that short. I think I've seen reports in Germany where people say it will only pay off after 20, 30 years, which is almost the time of the entire mortgage. So how do you deal with this in this situation where it's a good idea to invest into your home, but it's maybe not feasible right now given the economic situation? Where do you see that in the United States and also in Germany? Do you want to start?
Well, I don't want to be flippant with this answer, but I think that you have to think of the market as more than just a monolithic thing. There's 1 in 4 homeowners today is underwater, and that's a huge number, and it's not sustainable and needs to change. But on the flip side, that means 75% aren't. So that's 75% that can take advantage of these programs to some extent or another. And I think that you're right. It's a very difficult thing to imagine a homeowner who's facing foreclosure thinking about energy efficiency upgrades in the home. But I think we can still be creating programs that a portion of the market can take advantage of. And as the greater market corrects itself over time, then those programs will be in place and have a track record that they can then take advantage of. I think that's even more stark on the commercial side, where there are absolutely some buildings that are in dire financial straits, that are where the owners are holding cash and won't release the cash because of debt covenants they'll need to cover. That said, there's also a great number of buildings that are using a lot of energy that can take advantage of this, who have clean balance sheets that can take advantage of this. So I don't think that should hold up our policy process, but I certainly don't want to diminish the tragedy of the crisis by saying that.
But I think it's also a policy argument. I think it's very important that towns or communities make a very good town planning, because I see still towns, especially in my area where I live, it's south of Hamburg, where because people have come out of Hamburg and wanted to live in the green, they're creating new areas of building new homes. And I think that's a big mistake, because especially in Germany, we have a demographic factor which shows that in 20 years' time we will have less people than today, not more. That's different in the States, but in Germany it is like that. So there will be a lot more houses which will be empty, not out of financial reasons, because simply there are no people. So I think the town planning is very important, that the towns think about what do we want. We need to pay our infrastructure. It means wastewater plants, water, the water provision, and stuff like that. So they have to see that they must have an interest in keeping their town in a size which they can oversee, and that the old houses either have to be diminished or to be retrofitted, and not simply new houses built on top of that. And then they can help also with local programs. For instance, our town made very early a local program for solar thermal use, so that you have hot water out of that. And we benefited from that. And we got it out actually in 3 or 4 years, because our heating bill reduced by 1/3. That's quite a lot, I think, because we don't need heating in summer because of the hot water only. And that's, I think, for a lot of people, if you really show it, so communication and campaign is a very important point. If you really show it, then you can see that even with old buildings you can do a lot, except that they are so bad that, like the thing I showed you in Freiburg, they build a new one and then properly made, and that's okay as well. But then you have to make a decision, and that is that's also a policy problem. So that politics has to take decisions.
I think just briefly, I'd follow up on the planning discussion, because it's incredibly important. Over the last decade, we've been seeing more and more people moving back into cities, which has been great in America, because for so long we had such a strong focus on suburban and ex-urban construction. However, in the last decade, we also had lots of homes built out in the suburbs and the far out exurbs. And so right now what you're starting to see is a hollowing out of these suburbs and exurban areas. And so what we do with those homes is going to be incredibly important, because it's hard to figure out exactly what the best answer is there. You have McMansions that were built that were just these giant homes far away from where people work, live, and play. And we need to do something to kind of change this conversation. We're finally starting to see the American house size decrease, that people are starting to put a little bit more focus on living close to work. Being able to walk to shops, living in these livable communities. And so I think that's the goal. We need to make people realize that's what we need to be working toward. And I think we're kind of on the...
Again, policy problem.
Yeah, it's a policy problem. It really is.
Before people thought about green buildings, just the way we lived back then, and then of course Arne's question on hiding solar panels on roofs. Maybe Brooks, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start with the old building question, and I think we do take a lot from what's already been done. I always think of the example of the Octagon building, which is here in DC. It was actually our original headquarters, and it was constructed back in the late 1700s. And the way it was oriented was focused on making sure that you had the breezes going through it. You had large, high ceilings. You know, all of these things, all of the design elements, you had windows that were completely blocked off on one side, you know, to keep in the heat. All of these things were done because it was just how buildings had to be designed before you had heating systems and before you had electricity. And so I think when we go back now, and I think the LEED program actually does try to draw from some of those, because you have points for things like daylighting. You need to make sure that all of these kind of best practices, which go back even further than the 1700s, are incorporated into our current design of buildings. I think it's incredibly important.
A lot of people don't realize by new buildings, for instance, even if you don't change the design at all, if you put it correctly versus the sun, you save 15%, and that a lot of town planning or even architects don't consider by making proposals to their clients. And I think that's the first step to do if you build new buildings. If you retrofit old buildings, I mean, of course, you have to take simple logic sometimes to make things easier. But if you really insulate well and don't make a gas chamber out of it, then of course you will not use so much energy. And the oven inside is basically only an additional help for the times in between. I mean, in Germany, for instance, a lot of people now prolong the time where you don't have heating system with the oven in the middle, because they say, okay, in let's say March, April, or September, October, November, you don't need the heating because the oven is enough, because you only need it when you're sitting in the for the meal or so, and if you go to bed you don't need it. But I think it needs also a lot of communication and education on the issue, for instance, like daylighting. I was visiting once the Gap headquarters, which was made by the system that you can open windows and that you can have and that you have daylight everywhere. And then the employees came and wanted their cubicles back and didn't want to have the daylight. And I think this is something where you need much more education than we, because in Germany it's the opposite. If you have a room without daylight, people are complaining and say, even the work authorities come and say, oh, you are not allowed to work there for 8 hours because you don't have daylight. So it's a different culture or experience or whatever. So we have to do both things there. The question is whether we should hide solar panels. I mean, we have the discussion in Germany, as you know, as well, about the windmills, and that people sometimes think that they are bad that they are not nice to look at, and that's also a question of view, because I personally, when I come to Ostfriesland, for instance, I think it's a very nice view to see all these windmills and the green grass, and it has something like a peaceful image for me. And especially if you know that in Germany there were 30,000 windmills in the last century. There were the old windmills, but nevertheless there were quite a lot. So hiding things, I don't know, is the correct thing, but we had the same problem with the Denkmalschutz, with the monument protection, that they didn't want to do certain changes at buildings. And we had to argue very hard. For instance, I was arguing with the city of Wolfsburg, and Wolfsburg is under monument protection, as it is a city built in World War II or before World War II. And it was very difficult to get them to allow, to change roofs and stuff like that. But I think that also comes new techniques. I mean, the solar systems will change. They will change into nano films, which will be put on, so it will not be any longer this glass things, so it will be much thinner. I think it's only a question of time and incentive that the engineers will produce the new things. Fraunhofer is working on that very intensely, and I think Japan as well. So I think it is a question of time that you have all these new techniques.
Kurt, is anything you want to add either on the communication and kind of public education side, or on the old ideas or the other questions that have been raised?
Sure. Actually, maybe I could start with the behavioral comment. I actually think that's a great point. And if you look at within the United States itself even, there was a really interesting study done a few years ago looking at a subdivision where the houses were of the same age, same construction, same size, basically the same equipment in there. And looking house to house, they were finding 3 times and 5 times different energy bills related to just behavioral differences. So I think your point is it's a critical issue. But I think there is some hope here, because if you look at what's happened on the transportation side, they have, when Toyota came out with the Prius, one of the things that it did that was one of the smartest things they did was they show you exactly how fuel efficient you were being at any given moment. And it generated a certain amount of competition between people. And it actually forced people or compelled people, let's say, to try to do a little bit better each time. And this seems like, a very small thing, but it wasn't that long ago that car commercials didn't tell you what the miles per gallon was on a car and anything other than the small print. And now even truck commercials have the miles per gallon. And that's a reflection of where people's sort of behavioral mindset is now, that, we need to care about fuel efficiency. I don't think homes are anywhere near that level yet, but I think there's a precedent for it, and I think that's where we need to be pushing. On the education side, I think this is also a really interesting question, and I think it's a two-sided thing. I think there's obviously the consumer needs more education on the benefits of this and how to do this in a cost-effective way. But believe it or not, the contractors also need quite a bit of education. Lawrence Berkeley National Labs just came out with a study where 1 in 4 of the contractors they talked to didn't look at energy efficiency as a growth business for them. And that's a real problem. And that really I think that's something that needs to change, because when the rubber hits the road, the people that sell this project are not going to be government programs. It's going to be contractors. It's going to be the utilities. It's going to be your local Home Depot or your local hardware store, those types of folks. So those are the folks you really need to have bought into this. And I think if you look at when Obama had his meeting, I'm blanking on the date for this, but he brought together a large number of constituents around this issue. And the first person he brought into the room and sort of nailed down is, are you with home retrofits or are you against them, was the head of Home Depot. And the reason is, people don't have contact with their government officials as often as they have contact with the guy on the orange apron that sells the stuff. So that's really where education needs to happen. And I think that's where government really needs to be thinking about, how do we get those guys engaged? On a larger scale, I think, and apologies for rambling on, but the labor unions and contractors together, this is particularly on the commercial side, have banded together, the labor-friendly contractors and labor, to really create the kinds of programs and training programs that we need to see to create this workforce and to create some of that awareness of what energy efficiency can mean for the bottom line of a contractor's business, and and therefore to create jobs for labor unions.
No, I think it's a good selling argument that Monika made earlier. These are jobs that cannot really easily be shipped, because they're local and they use local material very often. So, and also the small companies that you mentioned, that 90%, where businesses 20 people and smaller that do the work. Maybe we should do an kind of blue collar orange roundtable the next time with Home Depot and labor unions. So that's a very good idea that we should take up. Monika, do you want to start with the question of the German experience with the green jobs, and how do you get the skilled workforce that's actually able to implement the changes? And I think there have also been complaints in Germany that you have so many requirements already that some contractors don't even know what they have to do to fulfill the latest version of the requirements that are in place.
Yeah, I think what was actually the point is to put together the associations of small companies, Industrie- und Handelskammer, but the Handwerkskammer, so the Craftsmen's Association, chamber, to really make education workshops and getting them done. And the good thing is, I think, about the money stuff and how you get the support. I mean, that the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, this is a state bank, who gets the loans, you can reach really 24 hours by a hotline which doesn't cost anything. So everybody can ask, every craftsman can ask, and you get really help. I mean, they're really helpful, they're friendly, which is not usual in Germany. You have a lot of people who are not friendly. My daughter is always complaining, why can't in Germany people not be so friendly like in the United States? So that is in this bank, it's quite good. So I think a lot of these things with the directives, it's a problem, but on the other hand, it's managed somehow, and it needs obviously some time. Everybody is educated, but I think at the moment there is something like, I would call zeitgeist, I mean the spirit of time, that people really want this, and that if you don't have a solar yet or don't have a new heating system yet, you are really a little bit looked at not so well, because you have all the possibilities. You get even money for that. To your point, I think the instability of young people, I think that's a very important point. And I think that's why it's so important that we get the landlords who rent out apartments or houses to invest. And that was up till now the biggest problem, to get them to do something. So I think that is only possible if you are able to make a directive on one hand and an incentive to share the cost, what you said, between the person who rents and the person who invests, so that both have something from that. And I think that's an important point which the new directive of the government doesn't fulfill properly, because they want to give everything, the costs should be paid by the persons who rent. And that I don't think is proper, because the benefit will be done by the landlord. And I think that has to be corrected in the new directive which has been done. And I agree with you that you would probably not do everything you could do if you know that in 5 years' time you have a job somewhere else. I'm in the same situation. I'm a person who has to move all the time because my jobs are somewhere there and there. So what I did this analysis of the house and said, okay, what kind of things can I do which will also fit in the next 5 years and probably get me some savings? And there are still things you can do, you get some savings. And I think this is the two parts with the analysis, with this pass, Gebäudepass, with a building pass. You have a lot of chances. You can do one step or you can have 10 steps. And that's, I think, the good thing about it.
Kurt, do you want to say maybe something about the to make sure that the energy efficiency is actually in place, that is advertised if you do the retrofitting of a building? What are the ways, the question of the green roof?
I can do my best.
Or if you can also, of course, comment on it.
Can I just comment on the transient question? I think that's definitely a major issue, and it's something that policymakers are thoughtful of, both at the federal and the state and local level. A couple things that they do now to try to get around this, and this is more for the homeowner and less about the tenant-landlord issue. One is that in some programs where they pay up front, and then they being the utility or some other entity pays up front, and the homeowner or business owner pays back over a period of time. Sometimes those are tied directly to the utility meter, so that when the person leaves the house, it's still, if it's an on-bill financing, for example, through the utility bill, that utility bill will still continue to pay for, that it will still be on that bill. So the homeowner would only pay for the upgrade as long as they're in the home, and then it would transfer to the next person. And that has to be, people have to see, when you sell the house, people know that they're taking on this obligation, but they're also getting the energy savings. Mm-hmm. There's also something called the property assessed clean energy bonds. And these are actually very similar, only instead of going through the utility bill, it's on your real estate tax bill. And that also transfers to new ownership as well. So again, they're making the payment, but they're also getting the energy savings from the equipment that's installed in the home. I'm not very well versed on cool roof versus green roof, so I'd probably turn that over to somebody else. And I guess just one other thing I want to mention on the Emerald Planet question. And this is secondhand information from our group, but we work with a lot of unions, and one thing they're finding is that they need someone to help develop basic job skills for people. So the technical skills are important, but they're secondary to some of the basic job skills that certain communities lack. And I think there's a great market there for building up that basic level of job capability that then they can go and take to add additional training to for more technical training and even for weatherization, which is sort of the entry level. So that would be what I've heard from our folks. I don't have any personal experience with that, but.
Brooks, do you have any closing remarks, any questions you want to address or comments?
Yeah, I can address the green building and energy efficiency question in that, yeah, there are quite a few buildings out there that actually did not meet the energy efficiency requirements that people believe they would. And part of this, I think, was that the LEED rating system years back didn't have as strong a focus on energy efficiency. With the new LEED 2009 rating system, they've actually upped the energy efficiency level that has to be met. I think part of it also is that green building is a holistic building process, that it's not just energy efficiency, but they're also looking at health and all of the other aspects of the building that make it green. I think code language will do a lot here, because if you actually have to meet energy performance targets on all buildings, that's going to really kind of change the situation. On the green roof versus cool roof question, I'm not exactly sure of the comparability on which is more energy efficient. I know that a number of cities have really focused strongly on green roofs, Chicago being the prime example, that Mayor Daley really saw this as a way to help green his city. The heat island effect was a real problem. You know, he was able to bring down the temperature by putting green roofs. I think there were like 3 million square feet of green roof now in Chicago. And once again, it was kind of leading by example. The city hall there has a green roof. And basically, you're able to get permits very quickly if you do a green roof within your retrofit or new construction, and that's helped immensely. Other cities like Philadelphia have also been pushing for green roofs. But I think more than anything, one of the things we found on the local level, which has been most interesting, is that localities kind of became the laboratories of democracy, much like states did back in the 1990s. You've seen innovative policies kind of bubbling up throughout the country over the last decade. And we're hoping now, and we're starting to see some measure of this happening, where the federal government is going to kind of pick up and run with it and take these great policies and make this national policy, which can really kind of lead us towards that sustainable future we all want.
I think those were very nice closing remarks. We are at the end of our time for this discussion. I want to thank again our speakers for your inputs and for answering the questions as thoroughly as possible. I also want to thank you for coming and joining us, and I hope you'll join us for future programs, not only here at the Goethe Institute, but at other venues as well. And before I let you go, I also want to make sure that you know that October is Energy Awareness Month, so you have still a couple days left to be very energy aware. And I want to thank all of you for coming and hope to see you again.